Good morning, everyone, and welcome to McDonald Schaefer's webinar about capital campaigns. The Dream It, Fund It, Build It webinar will explain what organizations should expect if they're planning a capital campaign, as well as what they need to do to be successful. My name is Paul Merline, and I'm a senior consultant with McDonald Schaefer, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm very pleased to introduce our two speakers, David Malone and Andrea Speth. Together, David and Andy have planned, tested, and directed capital and endowment campaigns that have raised tens of millions of dollars for nonprofits in virtually every industry sector, including healthcare, education, faith-based, environment, social and human services, arts and culture, and more. Together, they will share with you valuable insight about the capital campaign experience. These are the important questions we will answer today. What is a capital campaign? What are the 4 fundamentals essential to successful campaigns? How many gifts will we need to reach our goal? How can we be confident that we'll reach our goal even before we begin? And what are the best strategies for a successful campaign? And now I'll ask Dave Malone to answer our first key question: what is a capital campaign? Dave?
It's good to have you all online with us for today's webinar to learn more about capital campaigns. It's pretty well known in our profession that capital campaigns are among the more efficient and cost-effective strategies an organization can use to raise money, and that's why they tend to be popular. But what exactly are they? Well, having conducted dozens of successful multi-million-dollar capital campaigns, we've noticed that they have a few things in common. So the way we would define a capital campaign is it's a concentrated fundraising effort for a special project that emphasizes major gifts, is carried out with urgency, and has a start and a finish. Capital campaigns are concentrated. They're highly focused. There is an intensity to campaigns that you don't often see during regular fundraising. Second, they are most often for special projects, whether a new building, a renovation, a special piece of equipment, or a new program, contrasted with annual fundraising, which is meant to support operations. Third, they often emphasize major gifts over the more modest gifts that a nonprofit sees for annual support. Also, there is a noticeable urgency about capital campaigns. There tends to be an intensity and a momentum to them that you don't often see with regular fundraising. And finally, they have a start and a finish. That is to say, there's a launch date for a campaign, and when the campaign goal is met, the campaign commonly is concluded, contrasted with annual fundraising, which is ongoing. For most organizations, the process of a capital campaign begins with a dream. It begins with a vision. And the central question is, what more could we do to fulfill our mission if we had adequate space? What effect would it have on what we do if we could renovate our space, put on an addition, or even build an entirely new facility? When organizations run out of room or when their facilities have become seriously outdated, they begin to dream of something better. Some of you might be dreaming now of better facilities and how they would help you fulfill your mission. That vision could eventually lead to a new building project, a building project that involves land, architects, engineers, and construction. Some of you may already be thinking of land and talking to architects, putting ideas together, doing some planning. And all of that will be relevant at some point, but not yet. Not until the missing piece of the puzzle is in place, and that's funding. How will you pay for the renovation, the expansion, or the new building? For most organizations, there are 3 common sources of funding for new projects. Some use operational reserves if they have them, and not many nonprofits do. You can borrow money in the form of loans, bonds, or other conventional financing. Or you can raise the funds from philanthropic sources, including individuals, foundations, and businesses. This is fundraising, and in particular, capital campaign fundraising. All of these funding sources are possibilities, and some organizations use a combination of these strategies, but today we're talking about the capital campaign option. Probably the best way to illustrate how capital campaigns work is to tell you a true story. A few years ago, a group of volunteers in a small community outside of Milwaukee contacted us because they wanted to raise $10 million for a new YMCA. They wanted to bring a new community center to town, and they selected a YMCA. So that was the first part of the puzzle that they put in place in that project. The next thing they needed were donors, and in particular major donors that could help them fund it. $10 million is a substantial goal, and they needed people in the community that had capacity that could possibly make that happen. Well, it turns out there was a family in town that had been there a long time. The mother and father were born and raised there. They had raised their family there. They had started a business years earlier, and only a few years ago sold that business, a very successful business, and did very well on the sale of that business. So we thought they had an affinity for the community, and we thought they had gift capacity. So that was the second piece of the puzzle that we had in place. Now what we needed was somebody who would reach out to them, someone that they knew and respected and were willing to hear from. And we had a gentleman on our board who knew that family very well. He used to work in their business. And so he reached out to them, and they were receptive. And that began a series of visits around their kitchen table with this mother and father and their adult children. And we talked about what a YMCA is, the kind of benefits it would bring to the community, the kind of impact that it would have, and we eventually asked them to consider supporting it. And they did. They responded very favorably. In fact, for a $10 million campaign goal, they provided the lead gift of $3 million. It was a really exciting moment in the campaign. It did exactly what you would want a lead gift to do, and that is to get the campaign off to a great start. It inspired a lot of additional giving, and it was everything we'd hoped it would be. So if you understand that interaction, the idea of having a project, trying to attract donors to it, lining up people that know those donors, that are willing to advocate on your behalf, and then entering into a dialogue between both parties. If you understand that interaction, if that makes sense to you, then you really understand capital campaigns. Because if you looked at a successful capital campaign through a microscope down to the cellular level, what you'll see is that same transaction repeated again and again. Sometimes it'll produce a $10,000 gift, sometimes no gift at all, other times a gift of $25,000, $100,000, maybe even $3 million. Regardless of the size of the gift, it's the process that's much the same.
In our experience, most successful campaigns have some things in common. Dave, would you and Andy discuss the 4 fundamentals that are essential to all successful campaigns?
Yes, there are some things in common to all capital campaigns. And using our YMCA example of a moment ago, let's review what those are. Number one, you need to have an appealing project. What is the nature of your project? Number two, you need to have bold leadership, someone who will help you fundraise. Number three, you need to have sufficient numbers of donors or potential donors. And number four, you need to have a campaign office that is the infrastructure that supports the entire capital campaign, and that would include a campaign plan. Let's go a little bit deeper on each of these since they're so important to the success of all capital campaigns. First, let's talk about your appealing project and the questions you want to ask yourself as you consider your project is the project relevant? Even if it matters to you, does it matter to your donors? Can your donors understand how it will help you fulfill your mission? Do they see the connection? Next, is it compelling? Is there something exciting about the project? Is there something novel about it? Does it inspire? And third, is it urgent? Is it something that needs to be addressed soon or in the near future? Or is it something that can wait for months and maybe even years? If it can wait, donors will be less inclined to make gifts now. So, do you have an appealing project? Next, let's take a look at bold leadership. This is the group of volunteers that you will assemble to help you fundraise, to work the connections that they have to raise money for your project and for your organization. And these are the attributes that you will need to have in the volunteers that you are considering. Number one, are they committed to your mission and to this project? Both of those have to be true. They need to be committed to what you're trying to achieve if they're going to be an effective cabinet member for you. Second, are they known and respected in the community? Since successful fundraising has a lot to do with connections and access to people that have money and gift potential, the better known and respected your leadership team is, the better off you'll be in that regard. Third, do they have time to serve? Campaigns do require activity and action and outreach and visits with potential supporters, and that takes time. So your donors, if they're to be effective, need to have some time to devote to those endeavors. Next, are they willing to fundraise? Not everyone is, even those that support your mission and the vision of this project. They have to be willing to reach out and have conversations with potential supporters, and even with some coaching and mentoring, they need to be willing to do some fundraising and ask people for some support. And finally, are they major donors themselves, or could they be? This is not a prerequisite for all of your leadership team members, but if a person has connections and can make a major gift themselves, that's really an ideal combination. And making a major gift to your campaign early on is another form of leadership. All right, so the first two essentials are 1, an appealing project, and 2, bold leadership. At this time, I'll ask my colleague, Andrea, to discuss the other two essentials, major donors and the campaign office. Andy?
We've talked about the importance of a compelling project and strong leadership. Let's turn our attention to what really is the heart and soul of a capital campaign, and that's major donors. There are really three types of donors: individuals, foundations, and businesses. Oftentimes, our clients think that foundations and businesses will be giving the largest gifts to a capital campaign. And it's interesting for them when we share that individuals in most capital campaigns make up the largest giving to that particular campaign. Usually 80 to as much as 90% of the gifts come from individuals. So let's talk about what makes a major donor. They really share three attributes. They're affluent, meaning they have capacity to support a project. They're charitable, meaning they are known to give charitable gifts to other projects in our community or elsewhere. And they are interested. They've expressed an interest in our particular mission. So the ideal prospect for a major donor to our organization lies in the center of all of those attributes. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of major donors. This is a gift chart. Often we call it a gift table. In this example, we're looking at a $10 million campaign. The numbers would be scaled up or down depending on the size of your campaign. Starting at the first row, what this table indicates is that a $10 million campaign will need a $1 million lead gift in order to be successful. In order to realize a $1 million gift, the campaign will need 4 qualified prospects capable of making a $1 million gift. In other words, it will take 4 $1 million donor prospects in order for the campaign to net a single $1 million gift, because of course not everyone you ask for $1 million will say yes. Similarly, if you go to the next row, which is $500,000 gifts, a $10 million campaign will require two $500,000 gifts, and that means you'll need 8 qualified prospects capable of a $500,000 gift in order to net the 2 that you'll need, and so on down the chart. The point here is that you will need several qualified prospects at each gift level to reach your campaign goal. And a key question for you to consider as you look at this chart is, can you put a real name with each of these silhouette symbols on the chart? Let's look at a real life example in terms of looking at the importance of major donors. Sometimes I just think it's easier to see things from a real life example. In this case, the McWanago YMCA was the construction of a new YMCA in McWanago, and it was a $10 million goal. And here are the actual lead gifts from that campaign. And as you see them unfold here along the left side of your screen, you can see that there are not that many lead gifts, but the lead gifts made up 8.5 million or 85% of that goal. So it's safe to say without these lead gifts, a $10 million goal would not have been attainable. In the previous slide, we saw the impact of gifts of $100,000 or more and how they impacted reaching the goal. They accounted for 85% of the $10 million goal. If you look at the top 10% of donors, in the case of McWanago YMCA, 80 donors, they account for an astonishing 95% of the $10 million goal. And 90% of the donors gave just 5% of the total $10 million goal. So here again, you can see the importance of major gifts. As we talk about major donors, it's also important to remind ourselves of the donor continuum. It's important to be realistic about when any given donor might be ready to consider a major gift to your project. People move through a very predictable sequence before they become donors, and most have to advance further along the donor continuum before they can be considered legitimate donors. Although first-time donors can and sometimes do make large campaign gifts as their first contribution to an organization, it is rare. It's much more common for a donor who is somewhere along the continuum from experience to ownership to make the largest gift to our campaign. So now that we've talked about the appealing project, leadership, major donors, let's turn our attention to the final hub of a successful campaign, capital campaign, and that really is the campaign office. So the campaign office is responsible for things like developing a campaign budget and sticking to it and always being able to update where we are in regard to our budget. Developing policies and procedures that will safeguard the organization, which many are specific to the capital campaign process. Typically, they'll have gift tracking process and software, campaign management software, be able to run campaign reports so that we can always be up to date with our volunteer fundraising cabinets, able to do prospect research, which is really about developing really informed asks to put on the table to our donor prospects, proposals to foundations and other funding sources, and many, many more things. The campaign office is really the backbone of a capital campaign. There are a lot of moving parts to a fully operational capital campaign. I think you can see that from the slides that we've already reviewed through this webinar. To organize everyone involved, you will need a strong tracking system. Here's an example of our project management software, and this is actually a real-life example for the campaign for the Madison Central Library. We use this software to track hundreds of tasks in sequenced order following a synchronized timeline. When we direct a campaign, we typically work with 2 or 3 dozen volunteers and hundreds of donor prospects. In order to do this well, we need to have a detailed roadmap to ensure that nothing is overlooked. You will need a similar system that will bring both process and discipline to your project that might otherwise turn to chaos. Process and discipline are 2 important qualities of a successful capital campaign. Now you're ready to begin active fundraising. The essential elements of your campaign plan have come together. Over the course of several months, you have prepared your urgent, timely, and compelling case for support. You have identified major gift donors, recruited and engaged bold campaign leaders. And finally, you've organized your campaign office. You're ready to begin.
Thank you, Andy. Dave, once an organization has properly planned for a capital campaign, what are the main strategies used in the actual campaign?
All right. So during capital campaigns, there are two broad strategies that are employed: top down and inside out. What these refer to is that since campaigns are a lot about momentum and credibility, you generally want to approach your largest gift opportunities first and secure those larger gifts initially to give the campaign a kind of momentum and credibility that are important to attract other gifts. And that's the idea of top down. Imagine that you were watching two different campaigns unfold, and hypothetically say that both campaigns had $10 million goals. The first campaign receives lead gifts of $2.5 million, $1 million, two gifts of $500,000, and one gift of $100,000. Now contrast that with campaign B that is also $10 million, but the lead gifts for that campaign are $10,000. Two gifts of $5,000, two gifts of $2,500, and one gift of $1,000. Which of those two campaigns, the first or the second, do you have more confidence in? Which of those two campaigns are you more optimistic about? It's the first, because they have some serious lead gifts secured, and that gives people confidence in the outcome of the campaign. So that's the idea of top down. At the same time, you want to approach your donors from the inside out. That means approaching those that are the closest to the organization initially, like current board members or past board members or current volunteers that help fulfill the mission, or current donors or recently lapsed donors. Those are the types of constituents you want to reach out to initially on the inner circle of this graph, because those are the donors who need the least persuasion. They already understand the impact you're having. They already have witnessed that time and again. They're already supporting you financially for operational support. So the threshold for persuasion for those donors is relatively low. And that's why you want to start with your closest friends and constituents, and then work your way out to the broader community. Top down and inside out. Also, be aware that capital campaigns usually proceed through two phases. One is the quiet phase, and the next is the public phase. The quiet phase, as the name implies, is a stage of the campaign where you are discreetly reaching out to your best donor opportunities. And you're doing it relatively quietly, without a lot of fanfare, a lot of publicity. You're just doing one-on-one contacts with those potential supporters. And you're not broadcasting everything about your campaign out to the community. That will come when you do the public phase. The reason we do a quiet phase is because we may not know how the campaign is going to work. And so if the lead gift phase or the quiet phase is going particularly well, you might decide to increase your goal. You might add more upgrades that are available for the building project you're doing, or you might add an endowment to your campaign. Conversely, if the quiet phase is not going according to plan and gifts are coming in smaller than expected, you might decide to lower your goal, or unbundle a package of 3 initiatives you're trying to fund and just do the most important one and leave the others for later. So the idea of the quiet phase is that it leaves you room to maneuver depending on how the early stages of the campaign are playing out. And you'd really rather do that pretty quietly, without the scrutiny of the public and without the community watching what you're doing as you're making those strategic adjustments. Generally, somewhere after you've raised 50% to perhaps as much as 75% of goal, you'll want to transition into the public phase. And that is where you're using a lot of publicity and fanfare and your and traditional marketing channels. And at that stage, you are trying to encourage the community to support your campaign. Keep in mind that public phases often produce just 10% to 20% of a campaign's goal. So sometimes there's a misunderstanding that we need to be public about the campaign early. If only the community knew what we were doing, we would reach our goal. But in fact, quite the opposite is true. To illustrate this, I recall working with a client once, and every week when I would go to their community to work with them, I would pass by the local library. And the library was clearly doing a fundraiser of their own because they had a traditional fundraising thermometer outside on the yard. And it was, you could tell from the thermometer that it was a $1 million campaign, and the amount that had been raised was $300,000. So week after week, as I would pass by that thermometer, it was stuck on $300,000, and weeks turned into months, and months turned into more than a year that it was at $300,000. And what happened is the thermometer ended up discouraging additional gifts because people started to call into question whether that campaign was going to succeed. About a year after I saw it for the first time, I saw the number go up to $400,000. And then a few weeks later, the thermometer came down altogether, and I learned from one of their board members that the project had been indefinitely postponed. So you have to be careful about when you go public, and that's why you generally want to wait till you're at least at 50%, perhaps as much as 75% of goal before you announce it to the broad community.
When most nonprofits are considering a capital campaign, what is the one question almost all of them are asking? Of course, how much can we raise? Andy, how can an organization determine a realistic campaign goal even before they begin?
So many organizations that we work with start with a feasibility study. So what is a feasibility study? A feasibility study really discreetly measures probable interest in your capital campaign before you begin, while also expanding awareness and interest in your project through a series of visits with your best donor prospects and leadership candidates to evaluate their preliminary interest in the campaign objectives. I really liken a capital campaign feasibility study to due diligence by way of any type of due diligence that happens for a project, whether it's architectural renderings, developing financial scenarios. A feasibility study is fundraising due diligence. So your feasibility study answers several key questions, all important to the outcome of a successful capital campaign. Do your constituents agree with your vision? Do they think it's important and needed in your community? Will they support it with a charitable gift of their own? And finally, and most importantly perhaps, is how much money can you expect to raise for your project? Feasibility studies are really a whole topic unto themselves with many moving pieces. For more information on feasibility studies, see our companion webinar, Feasibility Studies, the closest thing to a crystal ball for your capital campaign. You can view this webinar at our website, mcdonaldschaeffer.com.
If an organization embarks on a capital campaign, it's very much like going on a long journey. And if you liken your journey to a road trip in your car, well, you can think of the four tires of your car being an appealing project, bold leadership, major donors, and a campaign office. If all of your tires are inflated and balanced, well, you're likely to arrive at your destination on time. If one or more of your tires is underinflated, you might eventually get to your destination, but it will likely take you longer than you expected. And if one or more of your tires are flat, well, you probably won't make it to your destination at all. As a firm that has seen every kind of capital campaign, our advice is to make sure all four tires are inflated and balanced before you begin. Thank you very much, Dave and Andy. If there is someone else at your organization that you think should see this webinar, or if you'd like to review it again later, it will be posted in the resources section of our website, along with a companion webinar about feasibility studies. And this concludes today's webinar on capital campaigns. For more information, please visit our website, mcdonaldschafer.com. In the resources section, you'll find an informative white paper, case studies about recent successful campaigns, and a companion webinar on feasibility studies, as well as other valuable free resources. Please call us with any questions about today's webinar, or if your organization has a capital campaign coming up and you'd like to discuss how McDonald Schaefer might be able to help you. Thank you for attending today's webinar.